I think it's important that you always try, at least, to ask for what you want. It will allow you to live a more confident and hopefully fulfilling life. One where you have less doubts and misgivings and thoughts in the future about what could have been. And one where you're living a life of more certainty of you tried the best that you could, and this is the results that came from it. No matter how good or bad they may be, no matter if they are or were what you expected and wanted. I think I came to this idea and I wanted to make an episode about this because I always kind of knew this, kind of had an idea of this, though never really implemented it in practice. But this idea really came up in a different way, in a different place that I really never expected for it to come up in. So first, let's talk a little bit about the backstory, the past of why this thought, this idea has been in my mind before, but I've never really implemented it. Growing up with my parents, they were very, I guess you could say, I wouldn't say very strict, but they had a level of strictness where it was always a little daunting to ask for what I wanted. And what I meant was I was always afraid of the reaction that would come from when I asked for what I wanted. Now, looking back, and even now, just looking at our interactions, this kind of fear was misguided because all the times where I've actually asked for things, the responses that my parents gave were always reasonable in that it wasn't like outright abusive. It wasn't abusive. It wasn't anywhere close to abusive. It wasn't anywhere close to being rude or anything like that. Oftentimes they would maybe not say yes, but at least say no, but then give reasons for why not. Or say no and still give a path to saying yes by saying you have to complete X, Y, or Z before we can consider this, right? And if you think about that detached of any emotions without taking it personally, like taking the rejection personally, you can see that it really was quite reasonable, their responses. Whenever I asked for something, usually they would say yes, and if not, there was usually good reason and there were options for eventually getting there, right? But I think the reason that I was scared and always cautious and unwilling to actually ask is just the overall dynamic that I had with my parents. Because in other places where I hadn't asked for things and they had very severe reactions to things that I did, basically there were times when I had messed up or certain events that I had done and they didn't like, their reactions were always, I felt, not proportionate, right? So to me, it felt like something that I'd done that was not a big deal, and perhaps it was bad, they had made it a bigger deal than it was, and they had given more of a reaction to it than I wanted. And growing up, when this happens a lot, where you do things that you really think aren't bad, you really think shouldn't warrant such a reaction, and you really think, it's just a normal thing, and instead you get such disproportionate and sometimes severe reactions, it gives you the sense, and that's what happened to me, that I don't want to risk doing anything that will provoke any more hurt reactions from my parents. And one avenue that often comes from this is being rejected when you ask for something. you fear that in their rejection, or even in their acceptance, the words that they'll say, the tone that they'll give, and the underlying statements that are there in their response carry a lot of the same weight that you've experienced before, and that is something that you just want to avoid. So with that context in mind, it makes sense how, because of unrelated previous occurrences and strife, where I do things and my parents react negatively, often in ways that I think are too severe, and these reactions, especially when I'm still a child and growing up, you want to avoid stress. You want to avoid these conflicts if possible. An easy way to avoid conflicts is then to just completely reduce the amount of possibilities for conflict. And possibilities for conflict come when you interact with your parents. And especially when you're in a vulnerable place, a vulnerable situation where you're asking your parents for something. You're in the vulnerable position. You're in the lower position, the disadvantaged position. They're in the position of power. They're always in the position of power, but this is even more so because you're directly asking them for something. You're more likely to get hurt. And when you've been hurt before, you don't want to get hurt again, which means you're going to limit any possibilities that can happen. Which meant, growing up, I was always hesitant and not very eager to ask for what I wanted. And instead, what I would do is just try and get what I wanted through my own ways. And that was how it went with my parents, right? Oftentimes, I would skip the normal, healthy step that you would probably have with a parent-child relationship, where if the child wants something, they should ask the parent first. This way, the parent is in the know. This way, the parent can provide, oftentimes. And it just builds a stronger connection. And I often skip that. I just didn't ask, and I just did it in my own way, did what I wanted. This manifested a lot in the conflicts that me and my parents had in terms of video games, where I never asked, like, oh, can I play video games? I just did it. I just went and played video games. And of course, the amount of times I played video games, they really didn't approve of that. So then that just in itself caused a lot of conflict, where they would argue and fight with me and then try and limit the access of the video games. And perhaps in an alternative universe, one where reactions and upbringings were different, I would have been much more comfortable with just asking my parents, hey, can I play video games? And I think a lot of our relationship throughout my formative years, and then through growing up through my teenage years, a lot of the interactions and development of our relationship could really have been different. So why do I go into this whole backstory of describing why I'm afraid to ask things of my parents, right? Well, of course, this growing up, me developing this attitude with my parents, it's of course going to bleed into how I interact with other people as well. Now, it doesn't take on the same form, but it shares similar characteristics. So, for example, I think lots of times the fear of rejection, which was slightly different from that fear of just any kind of conflict at all. But the fear of rejection is, I guess you could say, a small part of it that is tangential to the fear of any conflict at all. And that fear of any conflict at all with my parents then fed into this fear of rejection that I had. And this permeated through lots of my behaviors growing up and how I interacted with people. I think I previously had an episode about who should I invite, and that was in the context of like a wedding. And in that episode, I also talked about my birthday, right? And I think these two concepts tie in that part of the fear of rejection was what influenced why I never was very savvy or interested or motivated to actually try and have my own birthday party, because I was afraid of the fear of rejection. The rejection would come if I asked friends to come to my party and they rejected it, and they would say they're busy or something like that. And the fear was that I would ask people and they would reject me, and then my party would just not be as cool, not be as big, and not be as special to me at the time as other people's parties. So that fear of rejection, it ties in with that other episode of why I never really had birthday parties growing up, right? But this fear of rejection also ties in, first of all, just with getting what you want and asking for what you want. And this is exactly what happened with my parents, but this happens generally as well. Oftentimes, when I wanted something changed with other people, perhaps there was like a behavior that my friend was doing, and I didn't really appreciate it. I didn't really like it that much, and I wanted it to change. I think lots of times growing up, I had a fear of actually bringing that up, right? Because I had a fear of rejection, and in the more broader sense, a fear of conflict, a fear that I bring this up and then they don't change, that they think my request is stupid, and then they don't want to be friends with me. And to me, at that point, being friends with them, no matter how their specific behavior might not be to my liking, might be disrespectful to me in some way, or just could be an annoyance, no matter that, it was still more important for me to overall be friends with them and maintain the relationship, and instead not soldier, and instead just soldier on and endure any kind of annoyance or indifference from them, any negative reaction. So instead of directly trying to address the problem head on, I was afraid of the reaction that might come from it. I was afraid of the conflict, and I was afraid of the rejection that they would decide to not heed my request. So then I just decided to not bring it up. Now, these situations are, in a way, they're a particular type where technically I'm on a disadvantage level and the other person that I'm requesting is on an advantage level, in that I want them to change something, right? And the underlying assumption is that I want them to change something, or I want them to grant me something, to help me in some way. The underlying assumption is that I have to convince them to do it, right? The underlying assumption is that the other party does not want to actually change, and that I need to do some convincing. And then that's where the fear of rejection and conflict comes in, because they need convincing, because they need a reason to deviate from the status quo, the path of least resistance that they're currently on. I'm afraid that they won't do that, because I'm afraid my argument or whatever, my character is just not convincing enough to them to actually deviate. And this is how it is in most situations. But recently, I think the idea of asking for what you want came up in a different kind of circumstance, where it wasn't exactly this disadvantaged situation where I was on a lower, you could say, power level, advantage level, and the other person was doing something that they were set on doing, the path of least resistance, something that didn't want to change, and I wanted to ask them to do something. This was actually more, and this comes in the sense of a romantic relationship. The situation was, I was in a relationship, and my partner wanted to ask me if if she should stay for Thanksgiving break. So she was planning to go home with her family and spend the break with her family at home. And I was planning to stay in the place that I'm currently living, where we're both currently living, like the general area, right? So the choice for her was whether to stay in the general area or to go home. Now, why is this situation different from the previous ones I've outlined in this video? The difference is that it's not like she's set in one way and she was always going to do one way. It's not like she was always decided that she was going to go home. In fact, she wanted me to help her make a decision to either stay here or to go home, right? Because we're in a romantic relationship. Now, this is where asking for what you want and knowing what you want, this really failed me because I did not do it. If I had asked for what I want, I would have tried and convinced her to be like, you should stay here because I want to spend the Thanksgiving with you. I want to spend the time that we have, this break time that's been allocated to us, with you because I love you and it's a special time and I want to spend it with you. But me, being as a person that didn't ask for what they wanted, I was not very adept at that, and especially in this romantic context, I always came into it thinking like, I don't want to seem overbearing. I don't want to seem controlling in this romantic context, right? And how did I think I would be controlling? I thought I would be controlling if I was like, you should stay. To me, at that time, my perspective was, if I'm requesting her to stay, I'm influencing her decision, right? She's making a decision between going home for Thanksgiving or staying here. And now I am making it unbalanced. I am influencing her decision. I'm trying to tell her to stay here, especially if she already wanted to go home. I am making it more difficult for her because now I am, you could say, balancing the seesaw. The seesaw was tipped in favor of going home in her decision making, and now I am balancing it by adding more weight to the side of staying here with me. And that was my perspective, and I thought that was a bad thing because it felt like, especially if you wanted to go home, then it would feel like I am trying to convince her to do something that she doesn't want to do. It then sounds like I am controlling her in a way. I am not, maybe controlling is way too strong of a word, but I am influencing her in a way that I didn't feel comfortable with. Now that I've had time to introspect and think about the situation, that is a completely incorrect and kind of naive and, in a way, but I think it has tinges of misogyny or just controlling behavior, even though the whole reasoning was trying to not be controlling. I think the ideas behind it, in fact, actually demonstrate having a very dismissive and diminishing mindset of my partner. Why do I think that? Well, this whole idea of influencing her, right? The inherent assumption underneath that is that, in a way, she can't make her own decision without me. In a way, what I'm saying is that my decision is her decision. If I say that I want her to stay, then she will stay. Then I'm assuming, when I think like that whatever I say is what she does. In a sense, I don't want to be controlling, but in a way, I'm thinking about it from a controlling perspective, right? And that's the whole thing. I don't want to be controlling, but the idea that I would even be controlling when I suggested something is the toxic mindset. It is the mindset that somehow my opinion has so much weight, and apparently she has no free will herself, that she's just going to follow what I say. That's not how you should think about it. That's how, at least now, with some introspection, I think about this situation now differently. I think about it more of, for me, I should be asking and I should be saying what I want. I want her to stay because I want to spend time with her. And that should just be it. I shouldn't be thinking that this is somehow a very crucial thing for her making her decision, and that I'm somehow influencing her and controlling her. Because in a way, I am influencing her. But I shouldn't think about it as a control, because then this just diminishes her own free will, and it makes it seem like she can't make her own decisions. What the situation really is I should be asking for what I want, and I should tell her, I want you to stay. And I should respect her enough and her own decision making to know that she will consider her pros and cons for both. She is smart enough, independent enough, and responsible enough to do that herself. And I shouldn't be thinking about how I'm controlling her one way or another, because if I really respected her and knew that she had the responsibility, the ability to make her own decisions and to consider what is best for her, she's already going to have thought of all of this. And even if I said something of, I want you to stay here, she can make her own decisions and weigh the options and weigh the pros and cons of each, and then make her own decision. So me thinking that I'm going to be controlling her by suggesting that she should stay, first of all, it's very toxic. But then it feeds into that mindset. Me avoiding trying to ask for what I want, it supplements this toxic mindset. And in the end, I don't get what I want, and I also have an unhealthy view of the situation. If you seriously ask for just what you want and allow the other person to make their own decision, it gives more agency to the other person, because you're not thinking about, oh, I'm going to influence them one way or another. You're simply stating a desire that you want. And especially in a romantic context, in a relationship, you and your partner should have developed the mutual respect to know that expressing one's wants, the other person should be listening, taking those into account, and then making their own decision. And they should be taking that into account. But at the end of the day, it's always their own decision, right? So for me, when you're just expressing what you want, it's just a healthy expression of, first of all, your own needs and desires, and then respecting the abilities of the other person to either fulfill them, or if they really can't and they have good reason to not do it, then you know that you've expressed what you want, and you've also expressed that, what you want involves them and you're respecting their decision. In the grander scheme of not just this romantic relationship, expressing what you want allows you to walk away from a situation, no matter if it was granted or not. It allows you to know that I did my best. And I think that's one of the things that I want to really feel. I want to know that I did my best, which is why I've tried to adopt this attitude more, right? Because living in the state of what could have been, of always thinking like, if only I had done this, if only I had actually expressed, things could be different from how unhappy I am with this particular thing right now. If I had only tried, something could have been different. You're always going to be living in this what if situation. But if you actually ask for what you want, and you don't think so hard about how the other people are going to possibly reject you, maybe they do. Well, now you know that they don't feel this way, right? And you can recalibrate your own opinion of the other person. You can also recalibrate your own need. But the important thing is you've now gained more information, and you've also quashed that little part of you that will always be asking what if. Because now there's no more what if. Now it's just, this is what happened. There was a fork in the road. You took one, you gave them the choice, they picked the path. And now, at least, you won't be thinking about what if I never even posed this question. You know that you did your best, and I feel like that is the way I want to live my life, to have a more confident life and to be more at peace with my decisions. And, it's very tough to get there because sometimes that involves painful asks, right? Questions that perhaps if you hadn't brought them up, things really would have been better. But now that you've brought them up and a choice was made, and it's probably the choice that you didn't want, it can be painful because then you'll really be thinking like, I regret doing this. Which is why it's hard to, develop this attitude. It's a slow process. But eventually, I think this is the overall healthier way to approach how I want to live my life. And that's what I'm looking to do. To ask for what I want.